Thank you. Can you all see my presentation screen at the moment?
That's all good, thanks.
All good, excellent. Okay, I'm Amy. I came to Australia when I was 12, and I was a pastor for 9 years at a Chinese church. And now I'm studying full-time, doing my PhD. Now, my research question is, how do children of Chinese Christian immigrants from Hong Kong become regular church attending adult Christians in Australia? My methodology is the practical theology project. So I'm studying human experience for the sake of the church to enable faithful participation in the kingdom of God. And the method I'm using is qualitative, in-depth interviews, but I am doing it from a critical realist stance. So the way it conceptualizes reality is that there is a real world that exists independent of how we perceive or construct it. And ultimately, our understanding is a construction of our own perspective. So from this stance, qualitative data is viewed as, of course, the constructions or the perceptions of the participants, but it is also viewed as evidence of the real phenomena and processes. So I'll explain that a little bit further. But from this critical realist stance, that means experiences of God, such as prompting of the Holy Spirit, can be explored as real phenomenon. So using Basker's framework, he models reality using 3 domains. So the empirical is what we experience, what we can observe, and things like that. Now, in the actual domain, it includes both the experience events and also things that are not readily observed. And the real domain includes all the underlying mechanisms. So I will use an example to explain this. So this is a example from my data. So I have Priscilla here. So she dreaded going to church because she didn't have friends at church. So she went to ask her dad permission to not attend church when she was in year 11 and year 12. And because her dad really values education, so he gave her permission to do that. So in the end, her mark was not good enough to get into the university she wanted. And she had been praying. And obviously she acquired the practice of prayer through church habituation or practice of prayer at home. Now, unexpectedly, she eventually got in. So what she did is she interpreted that as God's intervention. So God has answered her prayer. So as you can see the color here, the blue, the light blue, is what is observed in the empirical domain, what is experienced. The red, the culture, the habituation, and God is in the underlying mechanism. So they belong to the real domain, which is not usually observed, but you can only observe the outcome, of these forces, of these mechanisms. So, for example, the underlying mechanism of culture, you can see how people behave because of the cultural forces, for example. So what I did is I collected data and I did 21 in-depth interviews. And basically I had about an hour to an hour and a half conversation with each participant asking them how they became a Christian. And I try not to interfere with too much with the words that they use. So it's basically their description of their journey. So the next slide just tells you where they're from and what sort of churches and that sort of thing. So overall, the way that I can conceive it is that there is a general contour of when they grow up in the churches, they are set on this path to become adult Christians. And in this path, they are given resources through different activities and practices. And also they also have encounter facilitators who have helped them. And in the past, they also face challenges. And usually, not all of them, during their late teens or early 20s, many of them started to evaluate their path. They ask questions like, do I want to continue going to church, or is this the sort of life that I want to continue to live? So that's, they would start to evaluate. And also, I find that with all 21 participants, they all move towards describing an experience that really defined their path. So I basically call that the path-defining experience of these participants. So for the analysis, what needs to happen is that I need to move from the participant's account to a theoretical account. So from the empirical domain, like what is observed, and also what they tell me, is to theorize about what is happening underneath all that. So basically, the method that I've used is based on Basker's DREI, which is description of the significant features, retroduction to possible causes, and elimination of alternatives, and identify the actual mechanisms. So basically, it can be understood as having three phases. So in the first phase, I've done the interviews, I transcribed them, I corrected the transcription, and then I would load it into NVivo and I started to code it, and I devised categories that would actually encompass all the significant features that I can find. And then I need to move, like it's an iterative process through an adaptive phase. This phase is actually trying to find a particular framework. So it's like a bit of a lens. I want to frame the data so that I can do further analysis. And in this phase, what I found is Archer's framework. I will talk about that a little bit more. It's actually the best fit. So it actually structure or conceptualize the data as structure, culture, and agency. And then I'm sort of moving sort of in the process, but also still in the abductive phase at the moment, towards theorizing what's actually causing these behaviors, and why are they continuing to go to church. So Archer's framework it's an analytical framework. Archer is a sociologist. So she is a critical realist. And so she structures like the world as having social structures that impinges on an agent as enablement and constraints. And similarly, culture also impinges on an agent as enablement and constraints. And the agent also has power, and he or she is active. And this is exercised through the internal processing, the evaluation, what is the best way forward. So in a diagram, this is what it looks like. So the participant would be set on a path to becoming an adult Christian. So on this path, she would face enablements from, for example, church and even culture, because they're given education, they're taught Bible knowledge and that sort of thing. But at the same time, they would face constraints, challenges in life, or even from the challenges within the church, and also some cultural challenges. And as she encountered the enablements and constraints, she exercises her agential power to decide what she is to do. So basically, what I need to do is reframe my data using Archer's framework. So, for example, the activities and practices that I coded would be reframed as enablements. And the facilitators are also reframed as enablements. And the challenges that they face would be reframed as constraints. And anything about the participant, what they think, the decisions and actions would be under agency. So if we use the same example of Priscilla, so if we have a look at the middle section here, this is the agency. Priscilla dreaded going to church because she didn't have friends at church. So the constraint would be a church constraint. So because, there's lack of friends at church, so we didn't provide a fellowship for her. So she decided to stay home and study instead of going to church on Sundays. So that's her agency. She decided to do that. And her father was okay with that because, being Chinese, they value education very highly. Performance is it's a very important cultural value among the Chinese. So that is a cultural constraint. But funny enough, she, because she wanted to get in what she wanted, she prayed, even though she left church for those 2 years, because her mark was a bit lower than she needed. And she actually promised God that she would recommit if her prayer was answered. But ultimately, she got in. So she interpreted that as God answering her prayer, and she recommitted herself. So from this particular agency here, we can see that she actually acquired the habit of prayer through the church enablement. And also in her inner world, I'm still trying to sort of theorize this particular bit, is that what is possible within her world, her inner world, is that, she can have a relationship with God and that God works in people's lives. So that is part of her inner world. So what I want to explore at the moment, or continue to explore, is that how her agency or the participants' agencies have been shaped. Because what the data suggests is that their past experiences have shaped their agency. It affected how they evaluate the process. So I'm going to give you a couple more examples. For example, Tom here, at an early age, Tom was already exposed to the Bible, the characteristics of God, and the story of Jesus. Through going to church, learning about God and hearing stories about what he did, Tom had a picture of God who is loving. And then Tom shared with me in the interview about his recent difficult experience. And he said, even in these times, the worst of the worst, like the pits of your roller coaster life, God does something in them and he uses it to make you a better character. So the agent's evaluation is shaped by the church teaching. So a bad circumstance is actually transvalued into something that is good. It's a character building situation. And this is another interesting example here. Joanna. Joanna attended a predominantly Caucasian school. She says, and I really felt a sense of trying to fit in, but never being able to, and a sense of being excluded. So on Sundays, I would be with people who are like myself, because she was in a Chinese church. But then I think there was like some sort of internalized racism or something. And she said, I enjoy spending time with my church peers, but at the same time, I thought I don't want to associate with Chinese people. At that time, Joanna thought church was uncool. So her thinking is influenced by her school, which is considered as a structure in Archer's framework. So on a Sunday, when she was in Year 10, Joanna and her friend decided to wag youth group and go to the movies. And for some reason, Passion of Christ was the only movie showing at the time. So they went into the theater with 2 big tubs of popcorn and with very little expectation on the movie. Joanna recalls something happened. Something happened to her. She was totally convicted. And she attributed that to the working of the Holy Spirit. And she explains that something happened in that movie cinema that only happened to her and not to her friend. And she said, I was watching it and just visually seeing what I had learned about intellectually. It just clicked for me. So once again, she's interpreting the experience as the Holy Spirit working. And so obviously that's been shaped by her experience at church. So I'm still working through this. So I would welcome any suggestions and comments. So my data suggests that their evaluation or their agency power is actually influenced or has been shaped by culture or the church. So that means the church and culture doesn't just affect the path as enablements and constraints. They actually shape how they evaluate or exercise their agency. So this is what I'm working through at the moment. So in terms of theories, there's a range, it's a spectrum. So some focus more on socialization, and Archer, on the other hand, focus more on the conscious nature of the agency. So I'm still working this through. I'm thinking it's something in between. So I think it's not just habit, it's not just norming, but on the other hand, they don't evaluate on a clean slate. So the agency has been influenced. So that's one area I'm seeking for comments and suggestions. The other area I'm seeking for comments and suggestions is I'm wanting to better conceptualize the experiences of God that the participants have shared with me. So these are the current references that I'm using. So that concludes my presentation. So I'll just stop sharing. So any questions or comments, suggestions?
Thanks, Amy. That's really interesting. I really like the methodologies you're bringing. I'm familiar with all of those. So it's been really interesting to see it. And I think particularly, I think they're powerful tools I think you've used. So I might have a few questions about those a little bit later on. But does anybody else have some questions for Amy? Anita, thank you.
Hi, Amy. Thank you
Hi.
for your presentation. It's lovely to see how you're progressing with your work. One question that I had was, how did you evaluate that they were mature Christians or adult Christians? Was it just their age, or was it I know James Fowler's theory looks at how Christians develop from seeing God as Father to being partners. And within that, his theory, he talks about Christians coming to adulthood or maturity where they start making their own decisions. So, my question was, how did you evaluate that they were mature or adult Christians?
Yeah, basically, I didn't evaluate them in that sense, but basically, that was in my sampling, in my participant criteria, is that what I wanted them to be, they are to be over 25 and have been going to church regularly for the past 5 years, and with at least one parent who is a Christian, and also they have been going to church since 12 years old. So that basically I am interviewing the people that fits into my criteria. And the reason why I picked 25 is that one of the statistics I think I picked up from NCLA's paper is that after 25, it plateaus and they stop leaving church. So they stabilize after 25.
Yes. The other thing I was wanting to comment on, you asked for books about experiencing God. There is Dermot Lane, The Experience of God, Tony Kelly, Experiencing God in the Gospel of John, and William James, A Variety of Religious Experience. So
Okay.
I just wanted to give those to you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Anita. Yeah, fabulous. Thank you. Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. It was really good to see a different methodology used and see how you progress through that in your analysis. So thank you very much for the presentation. I guess my question is just really about the presumption of the factors that determined the influences or the nexus between how the participant responded to God. I guess in the area of human sociology, it's sort of a bit more complicated in my mind around that. And there was other factors, I guess, from things like family systems, family of origin materials that I didn't hear anything recognised, which also flows through often in discipleship and discipleship from even teachers or mentors, a whole range of different other people that were involved. But I didn't hear that. It seemed to be like categorized in minimal numbers of places. How do you respond to those other areas that could be interacting on the person's life and their development to this point?
Yeah, so basically with the methodology, what I think is that I need to focus on a couple of experiences. So the experience that I'm going to focus on is the path-defining experience that they talked about. So this is the part about the theory. What you are talking about is actually about the last part about how to theorize what's happening. So what you talked about, like this family theories and things like that. So that would be like the underlying mechanism that would drive the behavior, so to speak. So that would be in the real domain, belonging to the underlying mechanisms. So I need to hypothesize or search for theory. So, one of them could be what you're suggesting, is how it actually causes the behavior of going to church regularly. Yeah, so that's part of my search for theories. So yeah, I would welcome any suggestions. Yeah.
Yeah, those hierarchical needs as well, as Murray Bowen's family systems theory. Are just two that I'm thinking of at the moment. So.
Yeah.
Thanks, Keith. Any other questions? All right, I've got a couple, Amy. The critical realism, I think, is a really great concept for practical theologian or Christian researchers, because it says basically there is an ultimate truth, and we might struggle to grasp it, and our research participants struggle to grasp it, but there is an ultimate truth. And I like that idea that you were saying that then helps us to the incomplete understandings of our participants helps us find the truth. So I was just interested, what, if off the top of your head, any scholarship related to critical realism that you thought was really helpful?
So actually, Margaret Archer, she's Catholic. So she talked about how, usually for sociologists, the order would be just the social order and the nature and that sort of thing, but she adds a transcendental order to the framework, so that that way you can start to talk about what's happening in that order. So she's a critical realist, she's a sociologist, but in most of her work, she just talks about culture and structure and agency. But it's only in one of her papers that talk about theology. She talks about that transcendental order. So that's a really, really usul critical realist. Also, Andrew Root, in one of the papers he talks about, I use critical realism because of his suggestion. He suggested practical theology. We need to, use critical realism in order to account for God experiences, and that's where, that's what led me to looking for this. Yeah.
Great. So that was Andrew Root.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Yep. I've got more questions, but anybody else got a question or a comment?
Yeah, just what you were talking about then, I was just looking at an article by Jiong and Othman. They take a Christian position on critical realism. It's a journal article written in 2016. So Jiong is G-A-O-N-G and Othman, O-T-H-M-A-N. So if you want the full reference, Amy, just message me if you want.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Keith. Just in terms of the enablement, so Arches is fresh to me, so I'm still getting my head around it. But I just got the sense that perhaps you were conflating church and God as being the same enablement. Just with the example of Joanne in the theatre watching The Passion of Christ and something happened, I thought that's God. I think you identify the Holy Spirit, but then when you were summarising it, I think you said that it was church. So are you distinguishing between church and God when you're talking about your enablements?
Yeah, so in my model, I'm going to add God as, one of, culture, church, and God as one of the forces or underlying mechanisms. But what the church has enabled her to do is to interpret that experience. So it's the interpretation I was talking about, the discernment. So unless she has been taught about a God who works in people's lives, she would not be able to, maybe she could. So that's what I was, so there's a distinction between the discernment, but also actual God working.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Good. Anybody else? No. Well, last. It's in terms of what other factors might be feeding into it. I think there's in the study of the psychology of religion, the long-standing principle of belonging before believing.
Mm.
So I think you probably need to touch on that somewhere in your paper. I know that there's no point rehashing what is already well accepted, but you might want to acknowledge that your theories about why people go down the path is building on that. But just make sure I would think, touch on belonging before believing. You asked. Oh, sorry. Do you any comments on that?
Do you have any references on that?
The classic one is by Stark and Lofland, Lofland, Stark and Lofland.
Yeah. Okay.
And the most well recognised source on the psychology of conversion, which sort of touches on what you're looking at there, is Louis Rambo. Great name.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I've got his books. Yep.
Okay. And I think he as one of the elements in conversion is belonging, and as belonging leads to believing. So, it might be worth touching on that.
Yeah, thank you.
And my last thought is you're asking about a theological dimension to socialisation and agency. It's probably worth thinking about the old, if you want to get into it, predestination, free choice debate. So,
okay.
Yeah. So is that the pathway predetermined, or is that the person who's getting in the pathway predetermined is sort of aligns sort of roughly with socialisation, but certainly the free choice agent, the Arminianism aligns very strongly with agency, which says yes, you've got the ability to make that decision yourself. My conclusion on that debate, which probably the heat's gone out of the Arminian Calvinist debate, I hope, unless everybody's going to fire up now. But I think it's the answer is both ends. I don't know how it works, but we're both predestined, but we also have free choice, and so it's both a factor of socialisation and a factor of agency, which enables us to find to go down the path, to use the analogy the very good analogy that you've introduced. So, any other questions or comments on Amy's presentation? All right, welcome back, everyone, and you should be able to see Keith's screen. So I'll hand over to you now, Keith, to do your presentation. Thanks, mate.
Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So, I'm just looking, I guess, just for overall look at how we've done this research. I haven't researched with someone else before as a co-researcher, so that was a new experience for me, but it's been great so far. But just looking at the whole objectivity, the analysis process, the conclusions and recommendations that we currently have, we're getting ready for a journal write-up. So I guess we just want to look at its functionality in regards to what we've done so far. So this is a joint project between the Baptist Association of New South Wales and ACT and Morling College, where I'm a senior lecturer in pastoral and practical theology. And this study was requested by the Baptist Association, and they came to the college, and I got involved in helping them to, as part of their Gen 1K vision of 1,000 healthy churches in a generation. So by 2050, having 1,000 healthy churches, diverse in form, partnering together in God's mission. Back in 2014, the Association of Churches came together and made that commitment, and they wanted to grow faster than the population growth. So that's approximately one congregation for every 10,000 people. And the BA, which I'll call as the Baptist Association, affirmed the desire for every Baptist church to be involved directly or indirectly in multiplying new congregations. And so this was new congregations to reach more people, meant reaching new people, new leaders, and generating passion for evangelism and disciple making. Since then, the association has 62 new congregations, and they found that as a reason for some level of effectiveness on that journey. The question comes, what Ed Stetzer said, is that if denominations want to be more effective, they have to become more like networks. And if networks want to last, they have to become more like denominations. So when denominations develop a network-like laser focus on multiplication through evangelism, mission, and church planning, they thrive. And so when networks build appropriate structure and define belief systems, they survive. And they are two sides of the same coin, and we need them both as we move forward. And so it was through this understanding by the Baptist Association they wanted to adopt a church planting network approach in amongst the many plethora of different methods when it comes to understanding how church planting works and the different ways of doing that. Church planting-based networks basically are a phenomenon. They describe a different and the definitions, I guess, is two or more churches partnering together to birth a new congregation that has a DNA for ongoing reproduction. So they fall into two main categories when it comes to this understanding of a church planting network. There's what we call a birthing network, where two or more churches come, where one main church initiates a commitment to an ongoing relationship and reproducing new congregations in partnership within that main church plant area. And the other one is a forming network, which forms two or more churches developing a shared vision to reproduce new congregations together. I guess if we wanted to sort of pigeonhole where church planting networks might fit in the history of church planting, the church growth movement and church health movements responded to the membership decline that we've recognised in the West. And they presented methodological approaches that focused on reclaiming the Missio Dei, or the mission of God in the church. And those two movements were based on an attractional type model. And then in later movements, the focus became more on the participation in God's mission in the world. And there was a distinct shift from an attractional to a more incarnational model that occurred. And so it's this second aspect, I suppose we could see, where church planting movements fit in, yet draws upon some of the aspects of discipling that we also see within the missional church movement and that and the initial church growth movement and church health movement. David Coles and Stan Parks say that a church planting movement is defined as the multiplication of disciples making disciples and leaders developing leaders, resulting in Indigenous churches planting churches which begin to spread rapidly through a people group or population segment. So we can see that aspect of Indigenous aspect or incarnational focus that then birthed into the emerging church and missional church movement. So in the Baptist Association of New South Wales and ACT, the growth result that happened over the previous decades has seen that there's been one CPN, or church planting network, planted 6 churches in 14 years and saw approximately 530 people come to faith. There was another church planting network that trained 45 leaders for vocational ministry over 10 years. And another network that went from a church of 400 people to 3 churches with 600 people in approximately 3 years. And all these congregations have diverse expressions and reflections that what we refer to as a blended ecology. And they reflect simple church, neighbourhood church, regional church, and resourcing type churches within those church planting networks. John talks about, to turn the tide of decline, churches should use multiple models to plant, institute multi-site systems, replant, or revitalise. And basically, the church planting networks are underrepresented in the peer-reviewed and academic literature. And so that's been one of the precipitating factors of this research. And so the research, I guess, is aiming to learn from where the Baptist Associations currently got to with their church planting network approach. And it aimed to hear the stories of CPNs and their participants and discern those recurring themes for participants in how these CPNs had been effective in their approach and what we can learn from them so far in that journey. And that precipitated, I guess, most obvious was a phenomenology as a form of methodology in regards to that. And so this undertook this qualitative study of phenomenological study. And if you're not aware of phenomenology, Sean Gallagher gives an introduction to that, basically from Husserl's area back in 1890, who's determined to be one of the main founders of phenomenology. And Gallagher says that phenomenology, literally the science of appearance, was a method that attempted to give a description of the way things appear in our conscious experience. The way things appear in conscious experience may be very different from the way things actually are in reality. But the phenomenologist on this definition is not concerned about how things actually are in reality. The phenomenologist is rather concerned about how we experience things. And so I guess that fits in with that critical realist theme that Amy was bringing out in her particular presentation before this one as well. In the method regarding that, there was a formalised method with ethics approval through our own college's LREC, Low Risk Ethics Committee. There was an arm's length process because my co-researcher, who was unable to be here today, was the one who held the list of people who had the inception and the determination of these initial church plants. And so he gave me the whole list, and then I put them out for selection. Those lists were wide and covered everybody who would have been involved in the initial inception of those church plant networks. My co-researcher didn't know who I approached and didn't know who responded within that process. So that's how we kept that arm's length approach and tried to deal with any coercion that could possibly take place if my co-researcher approached these people. Semi-structured interviews recorded were undertaken via Zoom or in an agreed location, and verbatims were undertaken, transcribed, de-identified, and then given back to participants to check for their own level of anonymity within what was there and de-anonymized in that process. So after that process, both researchers, my co-researcher and myself, then did analysis separately. And then we compared the themes that we had, and we looked at any divergent or convergent themes that unearthed against the literature. And we're still looking through the literature in determining that process, but have tried to determine what that list would look like. There was 14 interviews after 15 people were approached within 3 church planning networks. Network 1 was the oldest network amongst the 3. It had operated for well over 20 years. And had commenced with just 30 people initially. Then there was a multiplication of a network of 7 churches, combining to a membership of about 1,000 churches today. Their first church was planted in 2008, a bit slow to get off the ground. Then 2015, 2017, 2018, and 2020. So that's the replication process that we're looking at within the churches, planting churches, planting churches. And that's what a church planning network operates within. The church planning network concept wasn't formalised till 2016, and given that name and form, that's what is happening in this particular structure, in this particular way that things were operating. We would call that a birthing network because it was birthed from one particular church at that time. Network 2 operated in an outer region of Sydney, and its vision was to see 100 healthy local churches planted or strengthened in the suburbs around this particular area. And it focused more on funding ministry and mission through businesses, through a turnover, a target of $100 million with $10 million profit per annum. And other local Baptist churches and churches of different persuasions started to get involved. So it wasn't just Baptist churches. This was more of a forming network where churches came together from different denominations as well, that reflected a diversity of expressions. So in 2014, the first church plan after the church planning network came forward. 2015, 2 churches. 2016, 2018, 2019, another 2, 2020, 2021, with varying degrees of connection into the network and oversight. Part of that in 2010 was a training centre that was launched to oversee students and help them in their studies and understanding of how they might lead churches in that regard. And over the 10 years, they've equipped 45 people for vocational ministry leadership in different ways. The third network's the newest network within the last 5 years. And this came out of a birthing network from an established church. And they had this vision of the blended ecology, which was now called to work towards planting new churches and collaborating together with the resources that came out of that birthing process. After its launch of 35 people, it's now over 162 people in just a few years, with 30 people in another church working with de-churched and unchurched people back in September 2020 as well. And the second church is now grown to 40 people from 19 who, or from just a handful of people initially who went out. So over the 2-year period, Network 3, which has learned, I guess, the most from Network 1 and Network 2, has grown 11% since 2018, 13% in 2019, and it's now got an average weekly attendance of 311 people with 11 baptisms in 2020 as well. So depends how we define effectiveness, if that's is one of the questions, I guess, which is on the table. But let's get to the results of the research behind how we've done that process. And you would have that on your summary paper. But just to sort of note, through the themes that came out of that, through the coding process of the different interviews, these are what we found. And we've categorized them within the individual factors of a CPN, or Church Planting Network Church Planter. And one of the questions was, how has your experience been of a church plant in this church planting network? And this first comment is, I guess, typical of all participants. I don't see too many negatives. Definitely the positives is the consistent presence and support, encouragement and resource that's been there. Every church planter or person involved in the inception had a positive experience within that. In fact, the positives overruled all the negatives that they had in Gulf. They were aware, though, that they hadn't experienced a different form of church planting process, so they didn't have anything to really compare with. Although there was there's a couple of different participants who did identify that they had been involved in other different church plants in different places and with a different methodology, a different process, and they did find this was better in that regard. But planters in the CPNs were identified, or they self-identified as entrepreneurial, creative, innovative in spirit in their approach to planting. In fact, some of the different participants will talk about other planters in that regard. So that's how we came to these conclusions of why they were entrepreneurial and creative or innovative. They were actually identified by other church planters within that network. Each planter had a sense they were free to plant, operate without control. This was significant amongst all planters. Minimal control was felt by planners, and they felt supported and encouraged. As a person, they portrayed a courageous and risk-taking attitude along flexibility in their nature. And I think that was acquainted to their minimal control and the allowance of being able to take that risk, the allowing to be able to fail, whatever that might look like in their mindset at that time. Connection to God was evident, especially as planners were prayerful in what they ventured to do and were prayerful towards others in the CPN. And there was a lot of comments about different people in the church planting networks regarding prayer for each other across the different church planting churches. There was recognition of their own freedom to be accountable to others without coercion, but saw the need of seeking support instead of taking a Lone Ranger approach to their plan. In this regard, what we found was people didn't need to say, hey, you're going to be accountable to me. In fact, a couple of the places where that did take place, the church plants didn't succeed because there was this too strong process of accountability. In fact, because of the freedom, church planters decided to be accountable to the support group that operated. And I guess this quote depicts that. I suppose the biggest strength in our situation was really the relationship between the key leaders of each of the churches in our church planting network. And I think that would be the big possible hinge. If there wasn't the high levels of trust among the church planters, the sending churches and the senior pastor, it would not be a guarantee that it would go the same way that it has. And planters in the CPNs had an ability to overcome struggle and hardship and push through. Planters valued being mentored, discipled, coached, and enabled their vision to be achievable. And the call of God was important for all planters. Every planter mentioned something in the aspect of the call of God, and that may have come from a young age, this aspect of call to plant churches, or it may have come through some of their training at Moreland College or other places, or even through their own church planting network, and the DNA of that church planting network or their initial church they were sitting at gave them that sense of call as well. As we move through to the church planting networks themselves, so that was the individuals. Now we wanted to say, okay, what are the experiences of the whole church planting network? This first quote really depicts the experiences of those in the church planting networks. And they said, our network of churches is very relational. And it's relational because the churches that have been implanted within the network, they're planted by people known and loved from within our church communities. And so I think the positives have been the ongoing relational connection and a DNA. And I guess we can attribute that to the level of trust that we saw as well, because that's one of the relational aspects that all people noted. It was the mutual trust, the allowance of difference, mutual support, minimal control, but accountability that they desired to connect in with the CPN. In fact, one particular church planner in one of the networks, that CPN network number 2, mentioned that, yes, they were going through a hard time, a hard situation, and they were able to see the need that they needed to stay connected in with the support. The sharing of resources such as administration, preaching and people, local training, support for congregational issues requiring knowledge and insight. In fact, it came down to even the simplicity of we're running a youth night and another church within the network said, we've got this board game that could be good, we've used before, and they were able to share that resource across. And so there was this constant relational aspect of understanding that was going on for people in those networks as well. The CPNs were focused on allowing experimentation in church plant. They allowed risk. They didn't worry about that. And they said, oh, hey, do you learn and grow through that? So simple aspects of leadership development, I would think, that are coming out of that. There was emotional preparation required for the sending church, as they often felt a hole in the relationship, their resources and energy after a team or people move to a new location. So it was important to recognise that that is there. And that's something that may need to be discussed or talked about when church people are thinking of doing a church plant within a church planting network. What would happen? What are the expected feelings that might come about from the forming church or the church that's sending in that regard, or the forming churches that are working together? Another fascinating thing that we found was the providing of finances directly for a planter was not deemed effective by many of those actually interviewed. They actually realised that the journey of struggle and challenge to plant, being a co-vocational worker, resulted in a greater sustainability and resilience and ongoing effectiveness of them as a church plant and their connection into the church planting network. And there was some discussion in one particular situation of an expectation of finances, and that was sort of discussed and worked through and has been moving forward since then. But having clarity around finances wasn't a particular issue that arose in the expectations of the people within those church plants. There are multiple church planting models, but the CPN approach seems to fit, I guess, our Baptist theological and ecclesiastical distinctiveness of autonomy, interdependency, mutual accountability, reciprocating support, sharing resources, the acceptance of differences in style, and a more flatline approach into leadership as well. And the final aspect that we sort of collated together was the whole Baptist Association's role, or the denominational role, or the network's role overall. And this was depicted, I guess, by this one comment by one participant who said, I feel as though whatever investment has been put into the church planting initiative from an association level is having that filter through effect into my leadership into our church as well. So my experience has been very positive on the whole, incredibly positive. In fact, overwhelmingly positive. I don't think you could have got many more positives in there in regards to that. But the association's role was valued in providing the overall support to the CPN, less to the individual congregation, but as you can see through that quote, there's a flow through that happened there. So there was no expectation that the association was to be on the ground in those individual church plants, but rather working with the church planting network itself. They were the ones identified as assisting in the networking of CPNs to other CPNs within the whole Baptist Association movement. They were important in seeing the connecting of churches into and within with other CPNs across the state and across the territory. The sharing of learnings and stories of CPNs in their plants, providing resources for support for the CPNs, encouragement of CPN members, and developing training for CPNs. And there was often an annual corporate church planters network that would happen across the association, where all the CPNs were invited to come, which gave them broader exposure to other CPNs and other churches within CPNs in other places. This comment, I guess, depicts the finality of the comments that we received or the experiences of people. Overwhelmingly, this has been a wonderful, wonderful association to be a part of, where the impetus and the energy and the investment in church planting has been at a significant level and in a highly intentional level. And I think we're just only starting to see the first little trickle of the vision. So, that's a big call out to the Baptist Association. So good for them. So I'm sure they'll put that on their publishing and promotional literature as a result of that sort of quote. So in conclusion, the factors precipitating effectiveness in CPNs amongst congregationally based churches such as Baptists, I guess, are due to ecclesiastical facets of a more flatline structure that values equal power, trust, mutuality, and influence. It ties in with a priest of all believers that all people are valued and enabled to participate. It open to the autonomy of the local church that values independence and freedom without control, and its connection with other churches through an association in formalised and informal ways that enables accountability without coercion and control. The recommendations, we haven't, I don't think, finalised our recommendations, but at the moment we would say that further research on the CPN approach to church planting amongst varying regions, countries, theological spectrums and ecclesiastical expressions would be good to take place. Comparison studies to other expressions of church planting approaches, just to see divergences and convergences of church planting factors of church plants, church planters, and the network or denomination that it's connected to. Continued studies on more recent CPNs and how they may have progressed from learnings gained from older CPN experiences. Further analysis surrounding divergences and convergences between forming and birthing CPNs and the different differences and nuances within those particular approaches within the CPN model. And a comparison study between CPNs that got underway and CPNs that did not. And that was raised in a previous seminar that we delivered. And we thought, yeah, that's a good one to sort of keep thinking about and looking through. And there you go. And I hope that was helpful for you and inspired you to do a whole lot of church planting and get your movements and networks into the expansion of God's kingdom throughout Australia. So,
Thank you, Keith. That's a very important topic, obviously, but also good for us to look at the methodologies and the way that Keith and Jamie did that research. So, throw it open. Questions or comments from anyone for Keith?
Is John Newton supposed to be talking? Yeah, you just got to unmute if you are, John.
Yeah, sorry, I got mixed up with how to put my hand up, so to speak. But
that's all right.
Yeah, that was very interesting, and I hope it becomes a very fruitful line of church planting for Baptists and others that learn from it. That's great. The thing that you didn't really sort of say a lot about the phenomenology, apart from that one explanation about what phenomenology is, which was good. To what degree did the phenomenological analysis actually help?
Yeah, well, you're just listening to the experiences of the people. So you're letting their stories sit. So phenomenology is basically you listen to the stories, you look for the themes, you look for convergences and divergences between the different stories and picking up in that regard. And then you do a lot more of your literature review. So you're comparing that to current theory, current understanding in that approach. So it's a sort of a reverse process to some other forms of qualitative research in that regard. So it tries to diminish some of the biases and subjectivities that you might bring to the evaluation or the analysis of the data. So, yeah, that would be how I could say it. So it's about experience and to hearing the stories. It gives empowerment to those people who've told their stories as well. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, John. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how that is different from just doing it, so to speak. I mean, what is phenomenology bringing to the table that you would not have there anyway?
It's bringing experience. It's hearing the narrative, hearing the story, and I guess it's going to be starting to create new theory. In the fact that you're hearing what has happened and transpired. It's people's perception of reality. So phenomenology is drawing upon people's perception, which may be very different to reality. So by that comparison process, we're trying to determine something. I would say it's got to be, you've got to be careful with phenomenology. It doesn't go into a constructivist form as opposed to like a critical realist. Constructivism, I guess, just becomes a bit, for me, nebulous and denies the existence of God. But that's where I think, as Amy said before, critical realist position on this thing determines that there is a God, but whether there is something specific that happens within our world is different. God is constant. He's going to occur, but what happens in our world around us may be variance, and that allows for that in critical realism, I think. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for the question, John.
Yeah, I suspect what John's getting at there is, and this is one of my little theories, is that in a sense, a lot of the methodologies we use, like grounded theory or phenomenology or qualitative description or anything else, often end up with the same methods. So interview, coding, development of themes, interview, survey, or whatever. And it's just that the methodologies just bring a slight nuance to the perspective or what you're actually researching, I think. So this was a phenomenon. So the apparent success of these church planning networks is a phenomenon. And so phenomenology, it seems like a good way to get a good overarching approach. But then you end up using the same methods to collect your data.
Yeah, I think it's interesting hearing Amy's. I was thinking, tell me if I'm wrong, Amy. It was sort of like I'm constructing a theory that doesn't yet exist. That's what I seem to pick up with your methodology. Would that be right, Amy?
Yeah, critical realist, it's a bit of both. It's both inductive and deductive as well. So the end process try to see if there's a theory that would match the data, but if there isn't, so you end up actually constructing your own theory.
Yeah. Phenomenology does that a bit too. So I could see very similarity there with what you were doing. So yeah. I know there's a whole journal on phenomenologists, so it's like you can get dig right deep into all this if you really want to, and go into the philosophical background and talk about Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and the movement from Husserl right through Heidegger, right through to where we move towards away from God. The continental philosophers certainly moved away from God when your Merleau-Ponty and your Sartre. So yeah, Ruth.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Ruth from NCLS Research. Really enjoyed both papers and resonating and thinking about our own research in the light of what you've shared today. I've just got a question for Keith and also just a comment. My question is, I'm intrigued to hear where you are going to try and publish that paper. That would be just of interest. My comment is just to let you know that we've been commissioned to do some of the things that you're recommending, and we are going to be writing up results around church planting from the results that we've collected from across 20 denominations, so those who told us what they're doing. But we've also been commissioned to go out and actually look across denominations and movements to find out what they're doing over the next few years. And so it'll take that, we'll be knocking on your door to find out more about the Baptist story.
Great.
But we're going to also go to other networks. So just an encouragement that, we'd love to stay in touch around this particular topic because we're getting our teeth into it right at the moment and building the database that will allow people to come in and tell us what they're doing from the church planter, but also the network coordinator. who knows what's going on. So yeah, very encouraged and yeah, really interested.
Mm.
So but yeah, where are you going to try and publish? Taking a church focused project and actually bringing an academic perspective on it is not something we're intending to do at the moment, but yeah, interested in that side of it.
Yeah, I think we're looking at the Practical Theology Journal. That's probably one. I was wondering about the International Practical Theological Journal, but I mean, I don't know whether they publish in German as well, so I'm not sure. I'm not really good with my German. But yeah, that might be harder to get into, but I guess we could always at least try and pitch it at that level. I guess we want this for most people to sort of be able to engage and want to really inspire. We are looking at probably putting a book together as well with that. But yeah, I think if you know anywhere else you could recommend, Ruth, that we'd really value that. But exciting to see NCLS is getting into this now. So there's so many methods out there at the moment when it comes to church planting, the different approach. So yeah, we're just trying to define the church planting network approach, which is churches coming together.
Yeah, it's a nice frame. Thank you.
Yeah, it does allow a lot of variance. Like the churches are so diverse. The question we didn't look at it in our study, but my question would be how much about value and belief has to hold together, because we've had some challenges in our Baptist Association just this last weekend, and I was just thinking, yeah, okay, how do those values and beliefs, what's the minimum? How thick or thin do you have to be to work with somebody else? And I know one of the networks has a theological position which would differ to a whole lot of other people in the association, but they're part of that particular church planning network. So it's that sort of question. Paul, I saw you had a question before.
Yeah. Hey, Keith. Great presentation. Really good to see how you have seen your work. Obviously, worked through the last study leave semester, and this great topic. I think is a really dearly needed topic of research. Seeing, really encouraging the church planning across the denomination. I guess my question probably goes back to the topic of phenomenology again. I'm more used to methodologies like grounded theory or case study. But you mentioned that there's a scarcity of resources. You mentioned a few articles like Jun's article, but you know how when you were formulating interview questions, as you were interviewing those 14 participants, was there sort of key, constructs, ideas that you sort of depended on as you formulated those questions for the phenomenological study? Maybe I'm just pitching there. Maybe in terms of like maybe relationships or risk taking, was sort of key ideas that you sort of relied on.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Paul. I think that's a good question for the phenomenologist is you've got to be careful in the questions that you put together that you don't bring your own presupposition with what you're looking for. So you're opening it up to more within the context of the area. So in this case, it was church planning networks. So the questions related to, what are your experiences with church planning networks? How did you find that? And the questions center around how those experiences flowed. And then less interaction, like Amy, less interaction in the interview, but maybe clarification. So there would be clarifying statements that have I heard that correctly, which also checks the data as you get then transcribe it later on. So yeah, as general as possible, but within the context of the experience and exposure. There may be some key people, like how did you find other people in the church planning networks? How did you find the association's role? Because you knew they were the main players within that, but they were very general, if that helps. So it's not too defined, the question, very open-ended in that regard. Yeah. Douglas.
Yeah, I may have missed it, but I was just not quite clear how you moved from the list of contacts to the networks and the people that you actually interviewed. Right. What was the process there? Was it self-identification, or you chose according to some criteria? How did that work?
Yeah, that was picked up by our ethics committee, actually, how we would do that selection process. And it was all those who had been part of a church planning network within the association's list. So I'm not part of the Baptist Association. I'm at the college. So there's a degree of arm's length there, even though we have a sort of mutual relationship. And so that full list of all people who'd been part of the inception of church planting network, whether it was network 1, 2, or 3. So there was 3 identified church planting networks that had commenced over the last 20 to 30 years. And then all people who had been involved in that were given in that list. And then I approached those separate to my co-researcher who gave me the list. And then I approached them all. And out of that 15, we got 14 responses, which was quite a high number. And then after I de-identified as best I can, and then the participants checked it to make sure, are you happy with the level of de-identification? Because I'm sure some of the stories were going to be identified to him when he read them. But we're going to try and keep, I guess he working out, he picked up some of it, I guess, but those participants obviously realized that he would. So, but they were happy with that. So if that helps.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Douglas.
I noticed, Cole Studley, you're there, but your camera's not on. Just if you're there, Cole, I wonder if you could introduce yourself and just mention the research. Oh, you are there. Welcome. Yeah, the research you've been doing with your PhD, and potentially also the other thing that we talked about the other day, if you can, because Ruth from NCLS might be interested in that as well.
Yes, although when I heard what Ruth had to say, I thought, oh, well, that's a bit of a game changer. I'm very excited about it. Yeah, I'm just about to lodge my PhD, which has been a journey over the last 8 years, called The Factors That Determine the Viability of a New Church in its First 5 Years. I've based this on the experience of church planting for Queensland Baptists between 1985 and 1986 and 2015. And so it's only a small study, a very narrow study, but there's some interesting things that came out of it in terms of what we can do to ensure that more of our churches remain viable. It wasn't narrowed to CPNs like Keith says, although if I can just in parenthesis say, Keith, I thought that was really interesting, mate, and I'm excited to see what this brings, because we've got 4 networks in our state, and I think it will inform what we're doing so beautifully as well.
Yeah, great.
But we weren't, strictly speaking, I wasn't looking at CPNs. I was looking more at the general whatever church planting happened basically between those 2 dates. The findings around the internal clarity of the planting leader, the synergy of the team to the planting leader, the first transition from the planting leader, all of these things are what can actually create great viability and help churches to continue to do what they believe God wants them to do. And on the other hand, what can sometimes bring them undone. And so, yeah, we had an interesting experience. I've got a heart to research. I'd like to see more about, how more of our churches can remain viable. There's a lot of energy and heart and passion and emotional well-being that goes into the planting of churches, and what we can do to anticipate the issues and really get some support and help around them. That's very much what I would like to see done. But as I say, listening to Ruth's comments about what NCLS has been commissioned to do makes me think, well, okay, obviously there's some more thinking to do, but I'm very excited about the possibilities of seeing us much more effective in anticipating the kinds of issues that church planters face. So I think that's about all I need to say, Ian. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Cole.
Thanks, Colin. I'd appreciate if any findings you get with that. I think that's one thing I think our Gen 1K our Baptist Association haven't looked at, is really define what they mean by a healthy church. What's that look like? And it sounds like some of the material you've got could be helpful in them defining what that really looks like. So I really, appreciate that. So thanks, Colin.
Just in terms of publishing, the International Journal of Practical Theology and the British and Irish Association of Practical Theology don't. It'd be interesting. I would be surprised if there's been any articles that they're published relating to church planting. And so when you frame up the submission, you'll need to introduce the concept, and then particularly introduce the concept that you're talking about church planting networks, which is a fairly new thing, and make sure that you define all of your terms really well, because otherwise they won't have any idea what you're talking about. The other thing was that I think in your first slides, you talk about it being sort of an exploration of church planting networks, which is I think what you've done a great job of. But this is breaking new ground, because there's been, I gather, no research into networks, into church planting networks in particular. So this is breaking new ground, and just putting the language out there and putting the framework in place. But when you did your last slide, said it identifies the factors precipitating effectiveness. So that's actually moved from, we're taking a general snapshot or trying to get a handle on church planting networks, and then actually making a different claim about what your research does. From what I could see, I'm not sure you can justify that sort of level of certainty about what you've actually found in terms of success. And that's based on a couple of things. One, it's only 3 networks. So it's to do with your sample size. And I think as a qualitative researcher myself, I'm very defensive when people start critiquing my sample sizes. So I'm doing this with that coming from that side. So, but it is only 3 networks, and it's only 14 interviews. And what is not included in that is people for whom the church planting network didn't work. And as you said as well, it's also people who probably haven't got anything to compare it with. So they can certainly talk and give you a really clear picture of what the church planting network is like and its benefits. But in order to sort of be more critical of it and to be able to sort of say, I've got more confidence about what the nuanced strengths and weaknesses of it are, you've got to do your next stage of research, or your next round of research, which I know you've pointed to already. But I don't know, any thoughts on that?
I think we did have some data in regards to church plants that were part of a church planting network that didn't succeed. We haven't really analysed that hugely, but there was a couple within there, and they actually counted against what we found. So the things that fell apart was the overseeing, the control, the accountability really was the detriment. And that was spoken about in one of the other church plants. They said they were the detrimental things for that. So there was some from one plant that didn't go ahead. I think, there was a little bit there. So, but like you said, it's the beginning point of something. And we are breaking ground in talking about church planting networks, and hopefully we can precipitate other people to explore the inception of this type of style, see how it goes for them. But I take point about the concept of effectiveness, and I'll talk to my co-researcher about that, because he's the one who's sort of used those words, and I was sort of thinking, I'm a bit the same as you, Ian. What is really effective? So we'll have to be careful with our language with saying, yes, what is, probably not using the word effective is probably good in an article or something.
Well, you could, but you've got to just be a little bit more subtle in the way you frame it. Like, this research suggests that these may be factors in successfulness, but you've got to get to a bigger sample in order to validate that tentative theory. I think. Thanks, Steve. Intuitively, I think you're right.
It's all relative, isn't it? So just want to say thanks to Steve Taylor. Steve Taylor, thanks for your message there too. So.
Any other thoughts or comments for Keith? Well, thank you, everybody.
And thanks, everyone, for your comments too. Appreciate it.
And look forward to catching up with you again at our July meeting. Go well.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. See you, mate.